The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we take the pulse of the province on Premier Doug Ford's snap election call. Then, the complicated road of a dementia diagnosis. That's all ahead on the agenda. Last fall, we invited three of the province's finest talk radio hosts for a check-in on how Ontarians were reacting to the news coming out of Queen's Park. Now, with an election in our midst, we thought we'd invite those same hosts back on to see how the province feels about going to the polls a year and a half early. And with us, for more on that, we welcome back to the program in Sudbury, Ontario, Marcus Schwabe, host of Morning North on CBC Radio 1. In Windsor, Ontario, Patty Handysides, host of The Shift on AM 800 CKLW, and in London, Ontario, Devon Peacock, host of The Morning Show on 980 CFPL London News. Great to have you three back on from all parts around this province. Let's start up north. Marcus, tell us, what are you hearing from your listeners about the advisability of this early election call by Premier Ford?
Well, I think if you asked anyone a couple of weeks ago, do you want a provincial election? I think you would have been hard-pressed to find anyone who says, yes, I want an election. I want to go vote. I think that what I'm hearing is that there's no need for this election. It's going to cost a lot of money. I know conservatives and conservative organizers think otherwise, that they're hoping that Doug Ford can regain, if not grow, his majority. And so I'm sure there's an element in the north as well that who do support the Conservatives. We have several ridings that are conservative, thinking this is an opportune time. But I think for the average northerner, many of whom actually don't vote, voter turnout, I suspect, is going to be an issue in this election as well. And it's in the middle of winter, so who wants an election?
Patty, I got to say, I think we've all been following this stuff for a long time. The notion that a leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario would start on day one his election campaign in Windsor, Ontario, I mean, that's noteworthy, right? What are your people saying about that?
Oh, yeah, like even 10 years ago, that wouldn't have happened down here. But we do have two of our three provincial ridings are conservative now. And that's, 10, 20, 30 years ago, that just never would have happened. But that's the way things lie here. And I know, we know right away, as soon as we heard he was coming down here to kick it off, because he wanted to stand at the riverfront with Detroit in the background, which, of course, is north of Windsor,
yes.
To be able to keep, pointing back as he talked about the tariffs and about Donald Trump and the threat coming from the U.S. So, it was, it's a beautiful backdrop. It's a beautiful skyline. So we knew where this was headed. This was his main focus. And, he wanted to make it quite clear that he was pointing at the United States.
Patty, I'm glad you pointed that out, because you are, in fact, in the only place in all of Canada where you got to go north to get to the United States. That's a very interesting little piece of trivia, but it's true. Okay, Devon, come on in here and tell us about the early call and what your listeners are saying about it.
There's not a lot of enthusiasm for an election right now in Ontario. There's an enthusiasm to talk about some of the issues that are pertinent, but they could have been discussed without an election being necessary. So I'm hearing people who are concerned about tariffs, who are concerned about homelessness and housing and health care and some of the issues that have been around for a while. But there's not a great amount of excitement for the idea of an election right now, especially considering it is pretty cold out there. And just hearing from people talking about whether or not it's even necessary, and maybe not voting because it feels for some like it's maybe they know who's going to win already.
Well, you three would well know that your airwaves, television, newspapers, social media have been utterly blanketed 24/7, it seems, with the talk of Donald Trump and the threats about tariffs, certainly since, even before the president put his hand on the Bible and took the oath, but he didn't put his hand on the Bible, so I'll take that back. Anyway, let's get back to the point here. Leger did a poll of Ontarians, and here's what they said the most important issue was in their community. Sheldon, bring this graphic up if you would. Number one, cost of living. 28% of the people surveyed that as the number one issue for them. Number two, healthcare in general, 12%. Number three, the economy at 11%. Number four, healthcare meaning an access to doctors, 6%. Number five, healthcare again, this time wait times, number 6. Still no Trump's tariffs? There we are. U.S. relations, including the Trump tariffs, way down the list at 5%. Devin, I guess I want to know whether or not, well, we'll go around the horn here. How surprised are you that Trump tariffs are that far down the list?
Pretty surprising. We have spent a fair bit of time talking about tariffs here with London and its positioning in terms of being 2 hours from Detroit, 2 hours from Toronto. The London International Airport is big in terms of trade, and manufacturing is a big part of what we have here in London. So there's a real concern about the impact of some of those tariffs. London is pretty diverse in terms of the types of companies and industries we have here, but at the backbone, it's the auto, it's manufacturing. We have Volkswagen coming in supposedly, hopefully soon in a couple of years, and so just the potential change in administration and what that might mean for that type of an investment. There is some concern about just what might be coming in the next couple of days and weeks.
Patty, how are we to understand that only 5% of the people surveyed said the Trump tariff threats were the number one problem for them?
Well, cost of living, I get. I mean, top of the line there. I mean, that's certainly what people are still always talking about. But here is certainly that would be a different if you just pulled in this area, because number one, we're so heavily manufacturing centric that with the auto manufacturing that goes on here, that we know that, some of the cars that we assemble here, the vehicles that Stellantis makes here, the Pacifica in particular, trucks go back and forth 4, 5, even 6 times a day to make that vehicle across the border. Getting a part here, picking up a part there. It's called a just-in-time system. So we know that anything that happens at the border, as soon as you talk border, people here freeze. But we also have the largest concentration of greenhouses in North America here in our backyard in Essex County. And of course, we worry if the tariffs include any kind of produce, because just about any state in the United States, if you go into a grocery store, you go into a Kroger, look for the little tomatoes, things like that, you will find it from Kingsville and Leamington. Kingsville and Leamington shipped all over the United States. And so that is another fear too, that could stop those trucks from crossing over, because if that tariff goes on there, Americans aren't going to want to pay that price of adding 25% onto produce. So with parts and with things, and of course, as soon as you say border, we have 6,000 to 8,000 people cross every day who work in the United States, who live in Canada, and we worry about the border slowing down. We worry about, Donald Trump may say, to their CBP officers, hey, check everyone. So it's a huge concern here.
No, I get it. You want a thin, smart border as opposed to a thick, stupid border, which is the fear that may be coming. Marcus, how about in the north of this province, the issue of tariffs and whether or not they make up a big part of what your listeners are telling you about?
Well, I don't think they are yet. They could be. We did talk to a conveyor belt manufacturer in Sudbury. They make conveyor belts for the mining industry, and about 30% of their business is in the United States. So they stand to lose back, and so they're concerned. But I think for the average Ontarian, the tariffs haven't happened yet, and we don't know if they're going to happen. There have been a lot of threats coming from south of the border. So until it hits you the pocketbook like the cost of living does when you go buy groceries, I don't think it's going to become an issue for a lot of people. Of course, the media likes to talk about it because it's something that's coming up. It's political. But for a lot of people, tariffs are nothing until it hits, and Northern Ontario will be hit. Like we make nickel or produce nickel, copper. We're shipping that to the United States. The lumber industry, of course, has been hit hard by tariffs, softwood lumber tariffs in the past. There's only one paper mill left in Northern Ontario, Kapuskasing. They're concerned that all their paper is shipped to the States to make books. So if there is a 25% tariff, jobs could be threatened. So the potential is there. It just hasn't happened yet.
Patty, I note that 3 of the top 6 items on that list of what are people most concerned about relate to healthcare. Healthcare in general, access to a doctor, wait times. You could probably stick hallway medicine in there as well. How about in southwestern Ontario? How much of a factor is that?
There's still a concern. There's still a number of people, like everywhere else in Ontario, that don't have a family doctor, and that's certainly still a big concern. Healthcare waits, I think, is a big concern. We talk a lot about it because we're so close to Detroit. We're a minute away. A lot of times people will go over there, and there's been a growing number of talks, and you can see it on social media. We hear it here at the radio station of people saying, hey, I just got told by my doctor that I need to get an ultrasound on my hip or something, my knee, but it's a 5-month wait, and people automatically jump on and say, hey, go over to Boshi in Michigan, in Metro Detroit. There's 6 things, and it's $300, and they'll give it to you in 48 hours, and you can send it to your doctor, or they can send it. And that's what people here are doing. More and more people are taking their own cash and going to the United States to get especially diagnostics.
How about in London, Devin?
It's a concern. Healthcare, family doctors. I was talking to the OMA on my show earlier today, actually, about family doctors and the need in London, and it's growing. London is one of the fastest growing cities in the entire country. We're having more and more people come to move here, and they don't have a family doctor. Just not a short time ago, just nearby London in Walkerton, there was a couple hundred people who were lining up for a family doctor. So it's an issue in London. It's even more pronounced in some of the rural areas just outside of London, where I believe the OMA was calling it the Hunger Games. And so for family doctors in Ontario, in particularly in London, it's a great concern because there's a growing number of Londoners who do not have a family doctor.
Just out of curiosity, since you mentioned this, obviously the population of Ontario is increasing significantly every year. Most of the immigrants that come to Canada end up here. You said the population of London is increasing significantly. How come?
Well, a couple different reasons. We have affordable housing compared to other parts of the province, in particular Toronto. There was the projections that the city was recently working on for the long term for 2035. We've already blown past our projections for 10 years from now. And so it's a combination of a little bit of a hangover from the pandemic with people working from home and relocating to other areas. In some cases, we have people who live in London and work in Toronto because sometimes the commute in Toronto to Toronto is just as long. And so it's a factor where even though housing affordability is an issue in London for Londoners, it's still relatively cheap compared to other parts of the province, in particular Toronto.
What you just said is crazy, but true. It can be 2 hours on the train, London to Toronto, or it can be 2 hours within Toronto to get to somewhere you've got to work in Toronto. I know, it's insane. Marcus, let's get the word from you on the health situation in Northern Ontario and whether what you're hearing from your listeners jives with 3 of the 6 things that made that list.
Absolutely. I think people are concerned about healthcare. It was just 1 year ago that Sault Ste. Marie, the group health center, derostered 10,000 patients. So the 10,000 people overnight ended up without a family doctor. The province stepped in. Ross Romano, the MPP, who's not running in this election, did try to come up with some solutions. They've got some clinics that they've brought in, but if you had a doctor for years, all of a sudden you don't have that doctor anymore. And so for people in the Soo, I'm sure if they are going to be voting in this election, that's something that they'll be thinking about. Along the North Shore, there have been issues as well with emergency rooms having to cut back on their hours, sometimes having to close their doors, and that's a concern. If there's an emergency, where do you go? What do you do? So wait times in Sudbury has been an ongoing issue, where the hospital's over 100% capacity. So for sure, I think people in the North will be thinking about healthcare when they go to vote.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, because somebody sent me a note about this yesterday. The fact that Ross Romano, former cabinet minister, has made, it has not been a secret for the longest time that he was not going to run again. And for whatever reason, the PCs have waited until just now to appoint a candidate to run in that riding. What's going on up there?
Well, it's interesting because the Conservatives, I think they are the only party that have a full slate of candidates so far. And from what we understand is the candidate that the Conservatives have put in is from Toronto, worked in the Premier's office.
Chris Scott's his name.
Yeah, and I it'll be interesting to see how that goes over in the North. I think a lot of people, even when Ross Romano was sitting, questioned whether he lived in Sault Ste. Marie. He vehemently said he'd always lived in the Soo. That was his home, but there were some questions that he was spending a lot of time in Sudbury. So that's one of the 2 ridings, I think, in Northern Ontario to watch because, of course, Ross Romano is not running again, and the fact that the Conservatives have brought in a candidate from outside to run.
All right. Patty, want to go back to you on this. The $200 checks that were announced last year are supposedly going out in the mail right now to people across the province. I think you got to be 18. You have to have filed a tax return last year to be eligible. Okay, are your listeners giving the government any props for that or something else? You tell us.
Actually, you know what? People kind of find it humorous, and it's the joke has been that, when you get your check the back. Is that the ballot to vote on? When you cash it, are you actually voting and telling us how to vote? I think I actually got mine this week, so I do have a check sitting on my coffee table to cash. I don't know though that it's really bought anybody. Like, there's not a lot of chatter about it. People aren't. I think they are also kind of used to it. Came right on the heels of getting that carbon rebate in their bank accounts, a couple weeks ago from the feds. I don't know. I think people are just kind of not paying attention a lot. So people aren't saying that's going to sway my vote because of that $200. And people actually are talking a lot about, hey, that's my money anyways, right? I'm just getting some money back ahead of tax season.
Well, it's really not their money, it's their kids' money, because we had to go to the markets to borrow $3 billion in order to fund that little rebate there. So, Devin, I wonder if your listeners feel like they're being bribed with their own money, or they're happy to have the $200 in their pocket.
Well, people are always happy to get the money, but from a lot of people I've talked to, they have said they would have much have preferred that money went to different areas. I was talking to someone just about an hour before we did this, and they were saying they would prefer this money went to something like mental health. They asked me how much it all totals up to. I said it's about $3 billion, and they said they prefer that $3 billion to go to mental health. It's interesting. This week started with an announcement from the province about heart hubs for homelessness. In that announcement from the province, they increased some of their funding from about $370 to $550 million. This is a system that's built off of a hub system that London has been developing. And I had someone say, if we had taken the money that went towards the $200 checks and put that towards homelessness, that would have had far-reaching benefits than just $200 for people. So, and then people don't even, I got my check, but I've been asking people like all week long, have you gotten your check yet? And they didn't even know it would be a physical check. They just thought it would be, winding up in their bank account, and now they have to go deposit it, which seems like it's something from the 90s almost.
Well, of course, if you don't get an actual check in your hand, you don't know who it came from, and they want you to know who it came from. Marcus, how about in the north? How's it playing?
Well, it's almost as if there was an election plan for when those checks came out, but the election's still 4 weeks away, and I think by then those checks will be a distant memory. And elections are about change and whether people want change, and if they feel that things are better or worse. And I was thinking that if there was a family of 5 and if the kids are getting money that's $1,000 in their bank account, and they said, well, we're doing okay this month, maybe I will vote Conservative. Like I don't know what the thinking is. But there really hasn't been a lot of talk about it. Just whether or not people got the checks, I think people see through it as well. That this is a conservative strategy to try to win the election.
With a few minutes to go here, I'm always intrigued. I'm always intrigued about a couple of things. Number one, we know what the leaders want this election to be about, right? Doug Ford says, I'm the guy to protect you from the Trump tariffs. The opposition leaders say it's an early phony election call. We don't need it. And besides, it's a good time for a change. I'm always intrigued about what issues you're hearing about in your particular part of the province that maybe the folks who are at Queen's Park making up the platforms don't hear about, but which are particular to where you are. Patty, you want to start that off? What's a big issue in southwestern Ontario that we don't hear much about, but what they ought to know about?
Well, I guess with being a manufacturing hub, one of the big things we have going on right now, we have a huge electric battery plant being built. It's going to open next year. It is absolutely massive. It's LG and Stellantis together putting this together, and it's now almost built. But it will take 1,500 employees. But during the startup right now, they're bringing a lot of workers from out of the country in to start the training. And there's a lot of talk of people who don't now trust this system. They think that they're not going to get the chance at those jobs, that these jobs are going to go to foreign workers who are brought in. And, everyone's trying to fight back. The levels of government are saying, no, that's not what's happening. They just have to come in to train everyone. That kind of thing. There's a lot of mistrust right now with levels of government. with immigration, with foreign workers coming in, it's kind of, and it gets pushed off, and people, higher up just say, don't worry about it, it's fine. And then some, we do see some politicians also using it their advantage, saying it's the present government's fault, that they're bringing in these people to do this. It's almost like a political game, and I think it creates a lot of distrust in many levels for people. And there was already growing, we know that through the pandemic, growing mistrust and misinformation that's out there. And I don't know that enough is being done about the misinformation to get trust back.
Interesting. No, okay. We definitely don't hear much about that in the provincial capital, so thank you for bringing that to our attention. Devin, how about in your part of southwestern Ontario? What's something local there that we may not hear much about in the provincial capital?
It's interesting. I don't know if there's anything that is being overlooked so much in London, but what I hear time and time again, the issue is the topics and the issues are being underfunded. And so you go back to housing or healthcare or homelessness. It's the underfunding of some of these issues that are causing real issues. This election feels like it's about money in different ways. It's cost of living, but also, from talking to elected officials, we just had the State of the City address here in London last week, and the mayor was talking about a new deal for municipalities with cities increasingly having to take on provincial responsibilities, and the end line is the taxpayer here in London is increasingly having to pay more and more, and we only have property taxes as a lever there unless you find new revenue. And so it's an underfunding more than anything being overlooked, because it's just creating that tightness that's being felt by governments, but also the residents. So the cost of living, you could almost look at it as it for the people, but also for the government.
Well, that one they know about, because we were at the Rural Ontario Municipal Association conference last week in Toronto. I think, 30, 35 cabinet ministers showed up, and this notion of unfunded mandates, right? The province telling municipalities, you got to do this, but we're not giving you the money to do it. That came up time and time again. So they know about that one, but thanks for bringing that to our attention. Marcus, you get the last minute. Something from the north that we need to know about.
Snow. We've got snow, Steve, a lot of snow. And winter highway maintenance is actually a really serious issue in Northern Ontario. I know the opposition parties try to bring it up as much as they can in Queen's Park, but Highway 17 between Sault Ste. Marie and Wawa closed frequently. Even Highway 69 south of Sudbury through the Snowbelt Parry Sound closed when the snow gets too thick, too deep, too heavy, and people want that. They want the highways to be maintained in the same sort of standards that a lot of the 400 series highways are. I think snow will also be interesting in this election campaign. We had Mike Mantha, independent MPP for Algoma Manitoulin, on this week. He says they're not putting signs on lawns because there are no lawns. They're buried in snow. They're going to put them in people's windows so they're not buried by the snow during the campaign, this February election.
That's what you call innovation. Good stuff. I want to thank Marcus Schwabe, Devin Peacock, and Patty Handysides for coming onto our airwaves and letting us know what's going on outside the provincial capital. Great to have you three on again. Take care and enjoy the campaign.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Aaron Kelly, CEO and co-founder of Advanced Symbolics, Inc., is with us now to tell us what Polly, the AI pollster, has to say about the public's response to Premier Ford's snap election call and what the pressing issues of the campaign are so far. Aaron, always great to have you back in our studio. Nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, what are you picking up? What's Polly picking up in terms of the mood of the electorate right now?
I would say the mood is nauseous.
Nauseous? Really?
People are, we've come out of years of inflation, high housing prices, coming out of COVID, and now a trade war with President Trump, and not one election, but possibly two elections on the horizon in a short space of time. People are angry, exhausted. I'm not even sure which one is more ahead, but I think a feeling of there is no leadership and no control. And who's running the ship? We saw over 70,000 people just this week talking about this early election call. That is very big.
Oh, well, let me pick up on that then. Inside the Pink Palace, inside Queen's Park, the notion of the early election call has everybody, extremely exercised. Of course, the Premier's very gung-ho on it. The opposition parties think it's completely unnecessary. What's Polly picking up?
People are saying it's the number one thing they're saying is that this is a distraction. The Premier has a mandate. He's got a majority government. There is no better mandate in Canada. And not only that, they're saying it's a distraction from the tasks at hand, which is, healthcare, and how they're agreeing with the opposition parties. They're also saying that it's going to make him weaker, not stronger, in negotiating with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump likes to suss out weakness. And if you're a politician who said, I don't have a mandate and I have to have and you're in an election, well, this is an opportunity for him to bully you because you're vulnerable, right? And so that's what people are saying. How does this make any sense?
I don't know if Polly can forecast this at this stage, but, the opposition parties are clearly trying to make this early election call a thing. They would like this to be the ballot question. Unnecessary election, punish Doug Ford. Are you picking that up? Are people prepared to punish the Premier as a result of this?
It's early days right now because people are angry. So, but there's something, there's a there, right? Like if they can pick this up, and even more importantly, we're seeing now a lot of people are actually, because he's made this election about Donald Trump and not housing and anything else, people are actually now comparing him, we're seeing, to Danielle Smith. You know how he said you don't want Merritt Stiles or, Bonnie Crombie negotiating with Trump? Well, that's actually not his competition here. His competition is Danielle Smith. A lot of people are saying, how is he doing compared to Danielle Smith? And we've seen over time that people in Ontario even are liking her approach and wondering if that's going to get better results than we're going to turn off all their power and we're going to take all their bourbon off the shelves, And what's really interesting is that the people who are starting to say, I like Danielle Smith's approach, are more likely to say, and I think Merritt Stiles is more like that approach, which is interesting because Merritt Stiles is not a conservative.
No.
But Danielle Smith is taking a conciliatory tact here, and people are seeing that that's not the same tact that Doug Ford is taking, or that he's inconsistent in his tact. So it's interesting that the more that they go with Danielle Smith, the more they're moving away from Doug Ford.
That is interesting. Now, when the election was originally supposed to happen under the fixed election date law, June 2026, presumably Polly starts, looking into potential currents, waves in the lead up to that. I don't know 3 months, 6 months ahead of time? You didn't get a heads up this time, right? I mean, we're into a call almost a year and a half before you have to have one. So is Polly sort of caught off guard here?
Polly can work very quickly once we get everything up and running. So the way Polly works, just to revise how
Always
she
idea.
works.
Remind us,
what matters when you're doing election forecasting, it's not the technology that you use, whether I use phone polling or I stand on street corners, it's who you're asking or listening to. You have to make sure you have that representative view across the province, different ethnicities and age groups and income levels and professions and all of
Geographic
that.
locations.
Geographic locations, and you're matching the census data. So that's what we're doing. Now, Polly can, and what Polly is doing in her case is she's looking at these people throughout their history on social media. So she's getting a representative sample and saying, these are the people that I'm going to listen to in this election. And I'm going to listen to how they voted last time, how they voted 10 years ago. I mean, she can go back in time as if it were that time and see, well, why did they change? Do they change? Do they always vote the same? And what are the issues that have really been resonating with them over a long period of time?
So a snap election call shouldn't necessarily put off her ability to predict.
It should not. No, it will not. That's the only thing that will is, as we get closer, how solidified are people's votes as we get closer to Election Day? Are they still waffling as we go in? Because as you know, she categorizes people as definitely here, definitely there, and then lean. And it's those leaning one way or the other that she has to make a call on. And that's
Polly is deeply attentive to internet, social media, those kinds of things. But of course, there are a hell of a lot of people in the province of Ontario who are not on social media and who, so how does Polly figure out what they think?
Well, and that's why you have to sample it properly, because if we just took everything from social media, which is what social media listening does, it takes everything, you will be overrepresented in young people and certain income levels and things like that. So what Polly does is she says, I've already got enough 25 to 35-year-olds in my sample. I need some more people 65 plus. So she balances that. And that's how you do it with any kind of polling. You're never going to speak to everybody in Ontario in the next week or two, right? It's impossible. And it would be prohibitively expensive. So what you have to do is make sure that you're balancing the people that you listen to so that you compensate for the fact that you can't listen to everyone. And these people become it's a representative sample. So these people become representative of their cohort. And what you have to make sure is that sometimes when you can't get enough people to fill out a survey, you do weightings. You say, okay, well, I've only got 3 Indigenous people, so they represent all Indigenous people in Ontario. Hopefully I picked them right. For Polly, because we've got lots and lots of people that we get much bigger sizes, that's kind of an advantage there.
Polly's done pretty well in the past at forecasting certain outcomes. Brexit, Polly picked. The first Trump victory, Polly picked. But, she doesn't always get it right? No. Because she is evolving. You have to put new information in, and she takes account into that. How have you/she adjusted her brain since, let's say, the last Ontario election or the last presidential election, the last big thing?
Well, Polly learns each time. So Polly, and this is true for any AI. AIs learn through positive reinforcement, like a child, right? If you want to teach a child, to be polite or whatever, you say, please walk. You don't say, don't run, right? And it's the same. Well, I mean, that's a point of view on parenting. I know everybody has different views. But that's how you raise an AI, if you will. You have to put her through all these elections, and you don't say, well, you did this wrong, you did that. You say, okay, that was your forecast. Here's what actually happened. And she teaches herself. So we don't say to her, well, next time do this or do that. We say, thanks, Polly. Here's what actually happened. And then
machine learning kicks in.
It's machine learning,
okay.
So she evolves.
The public's perception of what's going on in Ottawa right now, we keep hearing about a power vacuum because Trudeau's announced he's leaving, but he's still there. They're having a leadership. Anyway, everybody knows the drill. How is that instability in Ottawa affecting what's happening on the provincial election scene?
Well, it's affecting it a lot because people were, I guess, hoping, like when, let's back up a few weeks. We had a power vacuum. We've had a power vacuum for a bit now in Ottawa. Doug Ford was seen as stepping up, and he was getting great kudos for that. He was bringing everyone together, and people were kind of seeing him as like a pseudo prime minister. But if he's now distracted by an election, then, what happens?
The vacuum persists.
Yes. And that's why I think a lot of people are saying, well, Danielle Smith is our person now because she's not running, she's not distracted, she's very focused, right?
She had a real 180, though. I know that when she first came out saying, I'm not signing the communique and I'm going to back my sector to the hilt and sorry about the rest of you. I mean, I talked to people who said, what a traitor. I mean, were Polly picking that up in the beginning?
We are. Here's what we're picking up. So yes, we're also seeing some people say, well, maybe the reason is because, well, Trudeau a lot of people think he's very polarizing and that she's affiliated with Pierre Poilievre. So we have all these different conversations happening online where people are saying, well, maybe she's just a traitor, or maybe she's getting results, and maybe when she says we need to give him a win, this is a David and Goliath battle. She's David. And
David won, as I recall.
Yes.
If I remember the story, David won.
And what she's saying is you're not going to win by saying I'm going to turn off all your power. And she's not the only one saying that. Scott Moe is saying that. And the Quebec Premier is saying
Legault,
that.
Yeah.
Legault, he's signing on to Team Canada, but he's also telling the media he's not going to turn anything off. So there's a bit of disagreement there, that this idea that you have to have this belief in order to be part of Team Canada. What happens to the premiers who don't believe that that's the right move? And people are starting to have that conversation. So I think people are more open-minded than black, white, she's a traitor, she's great. I think it's maybe she's got a good point. Maybe, we need a variety of possible responses. But here's something to know about Donald Trump. His motivation is that he actually feels that his country is vulnerable. Do you remember when the pandemic happened and we had no vaccine manufacturing? Right. And I think we still don't, even though all sorts of deals are being signed. Yep. If you can't manufacture your own vaccines, you're vulnerable, as we saw. Well, if all of your manufacturing happens in China and then you're having a war with China, Do you think they're going to send you supplies? Probably not. So by saying we're going to cut off your electricity, that just reinforces his view that America needs to be self-sufficient. He's trying to make America more self-sufficient. And that's why he wants the tariffs. It's not so much to punish Canada, it's to force his own people to bring back the manufacturing.
Got 1 minute to go. Let's do one more thing here, and that is, the opposition members are alleging that part of the reason Ford wants this early election is to get out ahead of potential charges related to the Greenbelt that may affect members of his government. Polly, picking any of that chat up?
Yes.
Like
yes.
what? What are you hearing?
So I asked Polly to rank what people are saying are the reasons for this election. Number one is distraction, and then number two is RCMP investigation. And then number three was Trump.
So people are aware of this Greenbelt situation.
They're aware. Now, the people who are talking right now are the people who are the most gung-ho political. It's probably your viewers, right? It's people who are politically astute because these are the earliest people talking. As the campaign continues and more people join the conversation, we'll see if that changes. But that's in the first week. In the first week, that message is definitely getting through. So it's up to the opposition people now to see if they can keep that going and keep that thread going, or if we get distracted, if you will, with the Trump tariff threats, whatever happens in February.
Understood. Aaron, we look forward to future visits during this RIT period, so thanks for coming in today, and we'll see you again down the road.
Thanks for having me.
Receiving a diagnosis of dementia requires a series of tests and a deep understanding of cognitive function. It also requires someone who can recognize the early signs. In short, the wait time for a dementia diagnosis is long. January is Alzheimer's Awareness Month, and to get a better understanding of the disease and the impact dementia has on the lives of the 750,000 Canadians living with it, we welcome Saskia Sivananthan, data scientist and neuroscientist specializing in dementia. She is the former Chief Research Officer of the Alzheimer's Society of Canada and the founder and CEO of the Brainwell Institute, and we are delighted to welcome you back to these parts.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you
For having me.
Let's start with some stats here, and we'll just get this on the record. Some basic stats from Stats Canada and the Alzheimer's Society for people living with dementia in Canada. There are, as we suggested off the top, 750,000 people in Canada living with dementia. As of the year 2020, it was estimated that more than 60% are women. By 2030, the Alzheimer's Society estimates there will be nearly 1 million people living with dementia. By 2050, a little further down the road, it estimates there could be more than 1 million women alone living with dementia. And it's projected that there will be more than 40,000 people 65 years of age or younger diagnosed with a form of dementia. Okay. This is coming, so let's get knowledgeable about this. What is dementia?
So dementia is an umbrella term for actually over 100 different diseases under that umbrella. So when people ask me, I often say, think of it like we would say cancer. We know there are different kinds of cancers, lung cancer, breast cancer. Dementia is the same. So what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? Same thing. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, but there are many others. Vascular dementia, frontal temporal dementia, Parkinson's-related dementia. But the thread that ties all of these dementias together is progressive cognitive impairment.
How does that present itself?
Right. So it presents as memory loss that is unusual for the person. So we all forget things, right? But this is the sort of forgetfulness that is more than just regular warning signs. This is a person who might be forgetting to eat regularly. They're not able to do the sort of activities that they've always done on a regular basis. And with dementia, that progresses. It continues to decline until they get to the point where the person cannot function by themselves anymore in their day-to-day activities.
We heard 750,000 cases off the top here, but I've also heard it's underreported. Is it possible that 750,000 is actually much bigger?
Yes. So thank you for asking that, because I think what we're trying to get at is the diagnostic rate. So that's the number of people who are actually living with dementia versus the numbers that are diagnosed. And we don't actually know the diagnostic rate in Canada. The estimate is about 50%. So really only about 50% of people who are living with dementia are actually being diagnosed with dementia.
Why would that be?
Lots of reasons. There's a lot of stigma around these collections of diseases, right? There's a lot to fear, and I understand that. You're thinking about memory, which we see as sort of core to who we are, and losing that over time is a very scary and stressful sort of disease. There's also really not a good system of care in place to get a diagnosis or to manage post-diagnosis. We didn't have a lot of therapeutic breakthroughs or interventions until fairly lately for the whole collection of diseases, but especially for Alzheimer's disease, the more common one. And then I would say ageism as well, because the highest risk factor, especially for Alzheimer's, is age. The older, over the age of 65, the older you are, the higher risk of developing dementia.
How difficult or easy is it to diagnose?
It is difficult. It is a very difficult disease to diagnose for a couple of reasons. First of all, in Canada, the way you would get a diagnosis of dementia is primarily through your family doctor. And as you've talked about quite a bit, including on this show, getting access to a family doctor is already difficult. But let's say you can get access to a family doctor. Only about 35% of family doctors in Canada report being comfortable with diagnosing dementia and managing it.
Because they don't have adequate training?
Exactly. They don't have adequate training. As well, they don't really have a lot of supports after the diagnosis. So let's say they're able to make the diagnosis. What comes next? They really don't have anything to really support the person. We don't have a system of support for it. So the average wait time for a diagnosis of dementia in Canada is 21 to 28 months. We're talking almost 2 years.
Is it as simple as they give you an MRI and you see something on the brain and therefore, bingo, I know that's dementia?
No, though it is certainly a component of it. So if you were going to go in to get a diagnosis with your family doctor, they'd start actually with a family history because there is a genetic component to some forms of dementia. They'd likely run some blood work as well to exclude that there might be other reasons, other deficiencies that might be causing the symptoms of memory loss as well as other symptoms. They would do an MRI or a CT, and they would see definitely in the imaging if there are any signs of developing dementia. But then the fourth is they would do a cognitive test. And that is tricky. It's difficult because we have language and cultural things that can influence how that test is administered and how people are going to respond to it. But fortunately, there are some new diagnostic tools that are coming out that should make that easier.
Like what?
So for example, there are blood tests now being able to diagnose whether someone might have dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease. There are eye tests as well that are being trialed and tested to see if that, so again, a little bit more objective, less subjective in a sense from the memory tests. And we didn't have any of those before. There are lumbar tests that can also be done, but those are quite painful, and so they try to avoid those.
I don't mean this to be facetious at all, but what if you're just like Joe Biden at that presidential debate and you're having a bad day?
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I don't think he's got dementia, but he clearly was confused that night. Yeah. What if you get a situation like that when you're trying to be diagnosed?
It happens.
It happens.
For sure. I'm probably going to have some of those moments myself, you know, if I'm stressed or I'm worried that I'm going to forget something. But it's progressive and it's consistent. So with dementia, you know, with Joe Biden that day, maybe he had a really bad night. He's under a lot of stress, right? All of those would coalesce to him having that forgetfulness that day. But over time, as you continue to see him, you shouldn't continue to see that kind of forgetfulness and memory impairment. That's the sign that it's not dementia, because this is a disease.
You mentioned doctors are not necessarily as equipped as they should be to pick it up when they see it.
Right.
That must go double, I guess, for the spouses of people who are presumably going to be the front lines on this thing and see it at first.
Yeah.
What kind of tools or skills do spouses need to pick up the possibility that I think my partner's got something here?
You know, I think spouses family members are usually the first to see the signs, because it's usually not, they know the baseline of the person, right? They know who their what the personality is. Because with dementia, it's, yes, there's the memory loss, but there's disorientation. The language fluency changes, personality and mood changes. So there's a couple of different things. And people often say, when they look back, that really those symptoms had been there for a couple of years and they just hadn't realized it. One of the key ones that caregivers have told us about has been financial changes. So if this is a person who normally managed the finances, paid the bills, things like that, and now we're having difficulty, they're not paying on time, they're withdrawing and sending money to different places, that kind of disorientation and memory loss all kind of coalesces, and you see it in the financial changes.
What if you don't have a spouse? There's a lot of older people who are living alone. How does anybody find out if they've got it?
It's a huge issue. This is a huge issue. And I mean, speaking from personal experience, my neighbor, when I was a master's student, had mild cognitive impairment and lived alone. It progressed into dementia, and he had no one to advocate for him. He had no caregiver. So he ended up going to different ERs all across the province and eventually passed away. So caregivers or a spouse are so essential. Some sort of a support system, whether it's a family member, a neighbor who's there to advocate and support you, is crucial. But that's also because our system is not set up to support people living with dementia and to diagnose them appropriately.
Let me go to the other end of the spectrum. There's kind of an expectation that if you're going to live into your 80s and 90s, this may be something you have to deal with. But as we said at the top, 40,000 people are going to get dementia under the age of 65.
Yeah.
Why is that happening? Why would there be so many more people so young getting it?
Thank you for asking that. This comes back, I think, to the idea of thinking of dementia as only Alzheimer's disease, and it's not. So some of the dementias, there is young onset dementia, which happens under the age of 65. There's frontal temporal dementia, which tends to happen in your 50s, sometimes even younger. Parkinson's related dementia, and these tend to impact people earlier in their life when they're younger. There's a strong genetic component to it. And that is because all of these dementias are pathological. It's a disease. It's not just the memory loss that is expected to happen as you get older. And it's likely hugely underdiagnosed, and we don't have a good count because we don't track how many people have young onset dementia.
Apparently you track the sexes of the people who get it, and many more women than men get it. Why is that?
They do. The thinking for the longest time was that women live longer than men. And so by default, you're living longer, higher risk of developing dementia. But we know that that is not the case, that there are sex and gender differences that are contributing to why women are developing dementia more than men. So some of the things, from a biological perspective, hormonal changes, menopause, when we see that estrogen drop, estrogen is neuroprotective, and so that may be one of the reasons that you're contributing to seeing that. Stress markers and inflammation markers are higher in women. Women also are at higher risk and higher rates of depression, which can also be a risk for dementia.
Is that because of the men in their lives?
I mean, I don't know, sometimes for sure. But also, if we could touch a little bit, there's a difference in terms of how women present with dementia, clinically sometimes different from men. So the ranges of symptoms are different. Their moods, the changes in mood and personality can be different from men when it comes to how they present with dementia.
Can you tell yet whether some people are more susceptible to getting it than others?
There are risk factors, yes. And right now, the estimate, and this is the population level estimate, is that about 40 to 50% of overall dementias could be prevented if we make lifestyle changes. But by prevented, I don't mean individually, it means you're never going to get dementia. But if you make these sorts of lifestyle changes with diet, exercise, all the things that we know are good for us, but are so hard to do.
Do a crossword puzzle every day?
Well, yes, the cognitive stimulation is absolutely it. Not being socially isolated. You know, during the pandemic, this was a huge piece. Better sleep quality. These are all the sorts of risk factors that contribute to the potential risk of developing dementia.
Once you've been diagnosed with it and it becomes apparent that you're going to need some kind of more invasive long-term care, how easy or hard is that to get nowadays?
It's very hard. Again, a couple of reasons. When you're diagnosed, depending on when you're diagnosed, we see and know that most people tend to get their diagnosis later in the development of dementia, so not really at that earlier stage, which makes planning very hard. And then at that point, sometimes it's a crisis moment. You're getting the diagnosis. About a third of people are still getting their diagnosis of dementia in a hospital. Not the ideal setting to get that diagnosis. It meant probably a misdiagnosis in the community or some sort of a crisis that resulted in them getting that diagnosis. So then you have emergency placement in long-term care or the long wait for a hospital bed, for a long-term care bed, and therefore a long wait in the hospital in alternate levels of care. So it is very difficult to be able to get that long-term care as well.
Is it like most things in as much as if you diagnose it early enough, it's easier to treat and it won't be as potentially deadly sooner?
Kind of on the nose and kind of not.
Kind of not, okay.
Yes. So the earlier you're diagnosed, the better, for a couple of reasons. The first is that you can plan better. You can put in place the kind of goals of life you want. What do you want in terms of how you're taken care of as the dementia continues, because it will continue, and it is a life-limiting disease, so you do die from dementia. But more importantly, a lot of the treatment options that are starting to come out for dementia are really, and specifically Alzheimer's, is in the earlier stages. There's also good research showing now that those lifestyle changes we talked about, again, if you can make those changes earlier, in your diagnosis, you can slow that cognitive decline so that you can put off how long it's going to be impacting you.
Would that be a case of staving off decline for months or years or what?
So right now the studies are only showing months, but they are doing longer term studies to see if it means you can stave it off for longer.
This is really something you don't want, is it? I mean, it's just one of the really nasty, awful ways to die, isn't it?
There's no other way to put it. I mean, it is a hard and difficult disease, and it's a hard thing to talk about. There's a lot of stigma around it. But just like with all those other diseases that we've been dealing with, cancer, stroke, heart disease, HIV, AIDS, by dealing with it, talking about it, and then starting to put in place the sorts of treatments and care plans we need, that's how we start managing it better.
I guess it's true that for the longest time, cancer was one of those words you didn't say out loud.
You didn't.
And then eventually, now we have galas and, big fundraisers and marathons and so on to raise money for cancer. And people are not hiding in the corners with it anymore.
Exactly.
Do we need that for Alzheimer's and for dementia in general?
We do. We absolutely do.
How do we get there?
It's a bit harder with dementia and Alzheimer's more broadly because people themselves who are living with the disease eventually get to the point where they can't express themselves, at least not the same way. And so unlike with cancer, where the person might be able to still talk about what their experience has been, it's a lot harder with dementia. And there is a healthy dose of ageism in our society. We tend not to value the later stages of life as much as we do the middle and earlier stages. But we do need to be able to have caregivers and people living with dementia more actively talking about what that experience has been, raising that broader awareness and pushing for the kinds of policy changes that we need to support it better.
I'm going to give you a little example here, and I want you to tell me how typical this is, because I remember meeting somebody in an event, and we had just the most fascinating, wonderful conversation. And it probably lasted 5 minutes, and then we went our separate ways. And I asked somebody else at that event about that woman, who I guess was in her 80s at the time, and I was expressing I was so impressed with how interesting she was. And the person said to me, yeah, now go over and talk to her again, and you will have the identical conversation with you, and she will not remember at all that she'd had it with you even 5 minutes ago. Is that typical?
It can be, depending on the stage that the person has with dementia. So the person you spoke to was likely at the moderate stages of dementia, which means that the short-term memories, which is that she had just met you 5 minutes ago, probably didn't know you before that.
Right.
So the likelihood that she was going to remember her conversation with you was lower. But it didn't mean that she couldn't express herself and that you had a fantastic and fascinating conversation
Absolutely,
with her, right?
but what it meant was if I was looking to find out if this person had dementia, I
Yeah.
never would have believed it in a million years.
You wouldn't know, exactly. And that is true with some forms of dementia, but as it progresses, eventually some of that language fluency starts showing up where they're having difficulty with remembering certain words and being able to express themselves well.
Okay, in our last minute here, you talked about how difficult it can be to get a diagnosis and so many of the other difficulties along the way. I'm sure there are people watching this or listening to this right now who are going to be dealing with family members who've got this, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a coming thing. It's here, and it's going to be even bigger.
Yeah.
What's your advice for them on how to navigate these choppy waters?
I think the first piece is that as scary as this disease is, you want to be able to try and get diagnosed as early as you can, and you have to advocate, you have to push. We do not have a clinical pathway of care for dementia through the health system, which means that there's no one going to help you to figure out where to go next and what to do next. There are local supports, so there's home care, long-term care, Alzheimer's societies, Parkinson's societies that offer some education and support, but you have to go find them and you have to advocate for them. But by advocating, you're able to get the kind of care that you need best for the person whom you're trying to support. And try to get that down on paper. Get a power of attorney down, write down what your goals of care are, and then plan those out because you still have control over all of those pieces. And get the kind of education that you need because as this disease progresses for caregivers, it's a whole new skill set that you need to be able to support the person, and you need to be able to get that kind of training early.
Gotcha. Saskia Sivananthan, researcher, neuroscientist, CEO, the Brainwell Institute. Really good of you to spend so much time with us here tonight on TVO.
Thank you for having me.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, January 30th, 2025. Tomorrow, JMM, John Michael McGrath, and yours truly unpack this week's early election call and much more on a new episode of On Pauline. Hope you'll be with us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.